Ghafla is heedlessness or forgetfulness. That the human being by nature is forgetful. If you look at it in terms of Vanity Fair, and many of the scholars have used this analogy in commentaries. The servant is sent by the king to go to the marketplace and get something. But on the way to the marketplace, there's a fair. I've got plenty of time, sun's high, I'm going to go look at the fair. He goes into the fair, and then suddenly entertainment, suspension of disbelief, preoccupied, gets lost in the fun. And before he knows it, the sun's gone down. Oh my God, the king sent me to the marketplace is closed, and I wasted my time in the Vanity Fair. This type of metaphor is related to this human condition, which is ghafla, that we become immersed in a type of heedlessness, that the world by its nature is powerful. In that, human beings become preoccupied. So how do we remind ourselves? How do we pull ourselves out of the Vanity Fair and remind ourselves daily that this is the world is temporal, and there is a journey coming. From the Muslim perspective, it is the reminder itself. A-dhikr.
Is God not imminent in the world?
I'm going to get to that. I'm going to get to that. I know you guys want to get let's get to the juice here. Imminent or transcendent. And the answer is yes, no. But I'll get to explaining that. People are overpowered. The prophets come. Now, interesting, there are 4 obligations according to the Islamic tradition for the prophets. The first one is truthfulness. They have to be truthful. They don't lie. The next is trustworthiness. They're trustworthy. If he says he's going to be here tomorrow, he's there. The third is conveyance, that they convey the message. And the fourth is wakefulness, fatana. The messengers are wakeful beings. They are individuals who have woken up to the truth. And we, in a sense, are like the cave dwellers of Plato's analogy. We are the people looking at the shadow world and believing this is reality. The prophets are those who have gotten out of the cave. They've seen the real world. They come back and they say, it's not those shadows. Don't be fooled. It's not. You're just seeing shadows. That is not the real world. These are images projected by a light. There's something out there that's real. Right? And this is the idea that the messengers come to wake people up, remind them, get them into a state of remembrance, not forgetfulness. Get them into a state of remembrance. So ghafla is the opposite of dhikr or remembrance. So in the Quran there are juxtaposed heedlessness and remembrance. Heedlessness and remembrance. Now, when the prophets come, they tell people, La ilaha illallah. The belief in the Quran is that no messenger has come except that he has said, La ilaha illallah. That is the universal message of all prophets. What will change is the second part of the Shahada. For the Muslim, it is now Muhammad Rasulullah. At one time it was Isa Rasulullah. At another time it was Musa Rasulullah. Jesus is the messenger of God. Moses is the messenger of God. Noah is the messenger of God. Possibly Buddha is the messenger of God. The Native American people here had prophets, had people that came to them to tell them about the nature of reality and the truth. So the idea from the Muslim perspective is that all peoples have been given these people that remind them, that tell them. Now, because of the power of the world and the unknowability of God, we move into the realm of paradox. And this is where we'll get to how we understand God in terms of God's creation. In the Western philosophical scheme, there are 2 concepts, transcendence and imminence. Transcendence is the otherness of God. Imminence is the the knowability of God, the presence of God. For the Christian, the imminence of God would be through Jesus Christ. Would be through Jesus Christ. That is how God became known to man. Right? God so loved man that he became man. That idea. That this is how the human being can know God. For the Hindu, the imminence is through the worship of forms, of idols. How then is God imminent for the Muslims? Because if we have the utter otherness of God or unknowability of God, how then, as an individual, do we feel any closeness to God? If God is so exalted and so above the creation, how do we feel any intimacy with God? For the Muslim, the imminence of God and the transcendence of God are related to two fundamental concepts about God. One is Rahmah, and the other is Ghadab. I want to get it there, right? That's where you want it. Justice. And you get the point. I mean, I could go on and on. There are many, many examples. This is the imminence of God. And this is the transcendence of God. It's interesting that the Quran begins, Bismillah. Allah is a transcendent name of God. It's not an imminent name of God. It's a transcendent name. There is actually nothing we can associate with the name Allah, according to the Muslims. But then the next two names are Ar-Rahman, Ar-Rahim, the merciful, the compassionate. That is, out of the three names that we are given at the beginning of the Quran, there are two relating to mercy and one relating to this transcendence or otherness. This is consistent with the Islamic worldview because the Quran says, my mercy is over my wrath. That the dominant quality that Allah is showing His creation is mercy, not wrath. But wrath is there. This also relates to two and very important concepts which are termed fear and hope. Now, if you want to look, because Muslims, like the traditional Christians, as above, so below. Right? What Durkheim and everybody, they turned it upside down. As below, so above. In other words, we're just projecting our world here on the other world. Fear is related to the father. The father for the child in traditional worldviews, not so much in the American type of ideal now. But in traditional worldviews, the father is transcendent, the father is distant, the mother is imminent. The first thing that happens to a child, onto the breast. It's not to the father, it's to the mother. The nearness that the child experiences in the world is the mother, and the father is distant. The father is watching the act from a distance. The word for rahmah in Arabic, so if we say mother here, the word in Arabic for mother, for womb, is rahim, which in Hebrew, rahim, they have the same idea. Jews have the same idea. Rahim is the same root word for rahmah, that it is through the womb that rahmah comes into the world. Without the womb, there is no sense of rahmah. And the womb is seen as one of the greatest rahmahs, because one, it is a rahmah in that this helpless creature is protected in the womb by a caring, loving individual that does not want harm to come to that which is growing in her and being nurtured because of her mercy. The idea of the mother, the compassion, right? It's the idea of compassion, that the mother is forgiving. The father, it's more difficult. And how many scenarios do we know in the human condition? How many scenarios do we know where the father throws the child out and the mother lets the child in the back door? I mean, this is very common in human conditions, right? The father, I'm not going to have anything to do with that. That's it. But the mother can't. And I know a friend of mine who was Jewish. He became Muslim, and they had a funeral for him after he became his family. And he was still alive, but they'd considered like that he died. But his mother used to send him cookies on his birthday, right? So the idea that the mother, even though this person has done something so severe in our tradition as that we cut him off, the mother doesn't cut them off. It's very difficult by nature. And this relates to the womb. The womb is empty. There's room in the womb for forgiveness, right? There's room there for forgiveness. Look at the womb. By its nature, the womb is a very small room in the midst of woman, and yet it can expand to take in so much. It has this flexibility, and it bleeds, right? It bleeds. The womb bleeds. It renews itself. And these are very powerful metaphors and images for this idea of imminence. If we look in terms of nearness and distance, how this relates to human beings, nearness is related to gratitude. Distance is related to ingratitude. Nearness is related to iman. Distance is related to kufr. So if a person accepts God and wants and strives to come to know God, that is a drawing near process. This is where we differ from the angels. The Quran says there is no angel except that he has a fixed place. The angels are fixed. It's not an upwardly mobile job. They are fixed. The cherubim, muqarrabun, are the nearest. And then, and also the great angels, Jibra'il, Israfil, Seraphiel, Mikael. These are the close angels in the angelic realm. But they are fixed. They don't disobey God. They only obey God out of jabr, compulsion. The human being has this interesting aspect to him or her. And that is, the human being can choose one of two things. This is where we begin our journey. The Quran talks about two phenomena. One is called darajat, which are upwardly. Darajat means stairs moving up, Jacob's ladder. Darakat are stairs moving down. Darakat are easy. Darajat are hard. And the difference between them is the jim letter and the ka letter. The jim letter in the Arabic science of the letters is a shidda letter. It's a hard letter. The ka doesn't have the same shidda. It doesn't have the same hardness. An individual at this point, as a child, it is born according to the Muslims in what's called the fitra nature, which is submission. The very first state of the child before the nafs begins to develop, and I'm going to explain the nafs. The very first state of the human being is submission. There is a famous teacher from Morocco. One of his students asked him, how do we come to God? How do we arrive to God? He went upstairs and he came down with a newborn. And he said, until you're like this, you don't arrive to God. Right? Until you're like this, you don't arrive to God. The idea is until you are helpless before God, until you recognize what your human attributes are in relation to the divine attributes. Because we are godlike. You see, the human being is godlike. You know, Shakespeare's idea of the paragon of animals. Right? How like a god, this human being. This form, the symmetry, the will, the volition, the power, the sense of independence, the ability to transform, the creative capacity within the human being. The human being is godlike. But this is delusional because he is only godlike in relation to creation. When the human being relates himself to the Creator, he becomes the most pathetic of creatures. He becomes the most helpless of creatures, the most incapacitated. We can't survive for a few minutes without air. There was once a Buddhist monk he was a master, had his student came to him and he said, I want to achieve enlightenment. He said, the first thing you have to do is learn how to breathe. He said, well, I know how to do that. I've been breathing all my life. He said, no, you have to learn how to be conscious of your breath. He said, why should I learn how to be conscious of my breath? So he had some of his students take him to a river next to the monastery and hold him under. And then brought him up. And he said, now do you know why? In other words, we forget how quickly we can lose our breath, how quickly we can become helpless, because we feel this sense of independence. And until we start becoming aware of our weaknesses, our inherent weaknesses, the most subtle is breath itself, because we are one breath away from death. Literally one breath away from death. So the fitra nature is that a child is in submission to God. As the nafs begins to develop, the first nafs that shows up, and nafs here is a very important word in the Islamic tradition. And I'll just go through a little bit in the semantic field of nafs. The root word is again nafasa. You have it in Hebrew also, nefesh. Nefesh is breath or spirit. And also, interestingly enough, psyche in Greek, same meaning, spirit, nefesh, to breathe. It's related to breath, right? Nefes has at its base root, it has two meanings. Nefisa and nefusa. All you do is change a vowel. One of them means to be precious, and the other means to be niggardly. So right there, in the Arabic language, there is a concept embedded in the idea of self, that we have two aspects to our nature. One is the bestial, and the other is the angelic. One is the selfless, and the other is the niggardly. One is the one that wants to give, and the other is the one that wants to hold on. And this is the human dichotomy. At the next level, if you go to the next root, which is nefasa, where you put a shedda over it, so it would look like this. Same root though. Nefasa means to help somebody, to relieve them of their constriction. In other words, to give them breath, to help them, to expand somebody who's constricted. But you go to the next root, nafasa. And it means to undermine somebody else, to compete against them. So it's right there in the language. The human being has these two opposing qualities. For the child, at the first level, you can see this already. One is that the child will smile and give the mother, melts the heart, right? I mean, you watch people's faces when they're looking at the baby and when the baby smiles, they all get, like they start kind of melting. Right? Why? Because it's like a gift from that baby. But then it starts screaming, I want. So right there in the baby, we begin to see the emergence of the dual nature. And we see it through childhood. I mean, I have a 5 and a 3-year-old, and you can see them moving between these two states. This amazing state of wanting to give, wanting to share, and then this other state of wanting to hold on. I'm not going to share. Right? Negation, affirmation. The world is negation. The next world is affirmation. Negating the world, affirming God. This is the human being. We are negators and affirmers. But if we get it wrong, what we should be negating and affirming, we go into trouble. So the first nafs is called nafs al-amara. And there's an interesting book by Robert Bly. For people that like him, some people can't stand him, but I like him. There's a book he wrote called The Sibling Society, which is about modern America. Because he's got this idea that Americans are turning into big babies, right? That they've lost this kind of sense of moving into maturity. And he uses the Islamic model of saying that many of us have become this nafs al-amara. Amara means the commanding self. It is the self that is commanding us to do things that we shouldn't do. And if we submit to that self, we become a slave of our passions. And this in the Arabic language is called abd. The Prophet said, wretched is the slave of the dinar and the dirham, of gold and silver. Wretched is the slave of his clothes. Wretched is the slave of his riding beast. People that become slaves of stuff, of the world. So nafs al-amara is the commanding self. Now the next move up is called nafs al-lawama. This is the blaming self, the reproachful self. The self is moving out of its abject nature. And it's beginning to recognize a type of moral imperative. The nafs is still doing wrong, but it's saying, I shouldn't be doing this. And this is consciousness. This is moving out of a completely bestial state and into a state now where there is a tension between the bestial and the angelic nature of the human being. And this is best related to the idea of Adam alayhi salam being created from earth and water. Water is a purifying element by its nature. Water in many traditions is related to consciousness. If you go into the Chinese tradition, water is related to consciousness. The element of water itself. Earth is density. Now, water allows light through. Light can penetrate water, but light does not penetrate earth. So the human being is mixed with these two admixtures of earth and water. That we have one aspect of ourselves does not want to let the light through and another does. And this is where you go into the nafs al-lawama. The reproachful self. You shouldn't have done that. Right? And this is I mean, some people have, modern people have put this into the idea of the id and the ego, and then the superego. You know, the id is more like the nafs al-amara, the compulsive self. And then the final self is called nafs al-mutma'inna. Which is the self at peace. This is the self that's submitted. This is the self that has submitted completely its being to God. And this self is no longer in this conflict. This is no longer in the religious state of I should do that or I ought to do that, but now it is moved into Kierkegaard's kind of ethical self. It now realizes that this is the right thing and it wants to do it. It wants to do the right thing. And it does the right thing now by nature, not by compulsion, not by feeling I have to do this thing. So the human being has two choices: to submit to the low self and take himself into alienation, which is wrath, which is transcendence. To literally place himself in a relationship to God in which God is absolutely other, disconnected from God completely. And this is epitomized by the idea of Jahannam, the idea of hell. That this is the ultimate alienation. Now, fire is a very interesting element because it can't rise above its nature. It has an upward motion, but it can't rise above because it's bound to the earth. You see, the fire only exists because of earth. And yet it has this upward motion. It wants to, it's moving up, but it's held down by, and this is the idea of being pulled down. You see, being pulled down by fire. And fire is very similar to light. It's not light, but it's very similar to the concept of light. I mean, there is light in fire, but it's not the light that we relate to the spiritual light, luminosity. The other is an upward movement. Now, there is a tradition that the Prophet Muhammad said, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, the fire is surrounded by desirable things. And paradise is surrounded by undesirable things. The idea here is, if we look at the pure outwardness of something and not at its inwardness, and we submit to the outwardness, that an outward thing can look very desirable, but what are its inward realities? So for instance, for a man who submits to his lusts, which is very common, one of the 7 deadly sins, and very common human experience. There is something desirable, obviously, for a male and a female to have a sexual relation. At the physical level, it can be very physically stimulating experience. But if we look at it outside of its social context, that desirability might be there. If we begin to place it within a societal context, what are the implications of this act? What are the implications of my sleeping with another person without any social responsibility? Because one pregnancy often can result. So there's an other, there's a third. There's a third that is the result of the act. Also, what is it saying about intimacy in a culture in which the most intimate physical act becomes profane to the degree that it has no emotional content? In other words, there are deep implications to the act itself. If we look at it from its desirability, it's a downward motion. If we look at the aspects that might be less desirable, such as commitment. Commitment is a difficult thing, to make a commitment. There are things that are going to be difficult that relate to it. But what is the inward reality? So outwardly, there are many people in this culture who do not want to commit to marriage because it's undesirable for them. They want to be free. I'm upwardly mobile. I don't want to be tied down. I mean, they see it, tied down. That's undesirable. Footloose and fancy free. That's how I want to be. What are the long-term effects of that? You see, what are the long-term effects? So outwardly, there are many desirable things, but then inwardly, there are many undesirable things. Just as outwardly, there are many undesirable things, but inwardly, there are many desirable things. So what the Quran, in a sense, really is trying to do is to get people to think deeply about things. And this is why it constantly talks about thinking about the aqibah. What is the long term? What is the subsequent results of the action? So this is in a sense is a model of human potentiality in terms of its upward movement and also degradation in terms of its downward movement. Most people are in conflict. Many people are not in conflict. They have submitted completely to this downward motion, and other people are struggling to move up. And some people are moving up. Now, in the modern world, we've become, I think, quite cynical in a lot of ways, but I think the ancients probably had, it was just that there was a sense of this. Even within our Western culture, there was a strong sense of the idea of this upward movement, that it was humanly possible. dark night of the soul, St. John of the Cross's type of idea that one could really achieve a type of power over the self and have completion and fulfillment in God. I think the difference maybe between that classical model in the Western world and the Islamic model would really probably relate to the idea that the Muslim model is not saying the world is bad. And the reason is because there's something, the world is seen as literally a theater of divine revelation. And the fact that God has made it a revelation means that it can't be bad. But to the degree that God is absent from the world is bad. So in other words, there's two hadiths of the Prophet. One said, the world is green and beautiful, and another one he said, it's like a dead carcass. It's green and beautiful for the one who understands one's place in the world and honors that place and rises up to stewardship and attempts to subdue the self and to be a caretaker. It is a carcass for the one who destroys his soul in the world and thus destroys the world as well. So the next thing move is the idea of what's called the belief in Allah, the belief in the books, in the angels, the books, and in the messengers. And then, I really didn't cover too much the angels, but the angels are basically beings made of pure light, created light, not uncreated divine light, but created light.